Hi guys, it's Mr. Y. Today we're going to be talking about vertebrates. Now vertebrates include three large branches, including the amphibians, the reptiles, and the mammals. I'm only going to be specifically talking about the amphibians and the reptiles in this particular PowerPoint. Mammals will come in its own PowerPoint later on. So vertebrates have been around for about 500 million years. They show up by the end of the Cambrian period, about 540 million years ago, when we see a lot of diversity, a lot of variety on the Earth. And of this variety, one of these gave rise to what we now know as the vertebrate group, one of the more successful groups that is still around. The animals called vertebrates include fish, that's fish with backbones, so not like sharks or rays, those are cartilaginous fish. So bony fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. And like I said, today's PowerPoint will be focusing primarily on the amphibians and the reptiles. They get the name vertebrates from the series of bones that make up the long backbone that helps to protect the spinal cord, which routes communication from the brain to the rest of the body. So if the brain can't talk to the rest of the body is going to be pretty much useless. So you have to make sure you protect the spinal cord in the best way possible, and you do that by encasing it in a very strong, durable set of bones like this, so that they're both flexible because they have such small interlocking sections of vertebrae, and they're both durable in that they can take a pretty good hit and not necessarily break the connection. So the origin of four-limbed creatures, otherwise known as tetrapods, all begins with a lobed fin fish. And there's really no distinct reason why tetrapods inherently had 4 digits as opposed to, say, 5 or 6 or 7 digits. 4 seems to be just the random number that tends to be more appropriate for most of the vertebrates that ended up being surviving till today. The fins of this fish became progressively more and more limb-like, while the rest of the body retained adaptations for living in an aquatic type of environment. And I'll explain what I mean when we get to amphibians. So here's a nice evolutionary tree of a bunch of families and branches of the fish family up here at the top that we have fossil records going all the way back to the Devonian. This is about 400 to 385 million years ago, and they're still alive today, so that's what it means to present. And you can see that with the coelacanths and the lungfish, but there's many other groups here that are not alive today. And we have only fossil records of these, and again, we're using half-life to judge the age of these fossils. So we know they were in some way related, and we know they existed for a time period, but after a certain point, they became extinct. And then we also know that from these groups, another group branched off right here towards one side with types of limbs that did go extinct, and one other type that didn't go extinct, which became the modern day amphibians, and one branch further back that became the amniotes, the reptiles, and eventually the mammals later on that we'll see. So amphibians and reptiles both have a lot of things in common. They're both eukaryotic in that their cells have nucleuses, endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi apparatus, mitochondria, all the major organelles with the exception of chloroplasts, that's only in plants, remember, that you have typically learned about. They're all multicellular, so you don't need a microscope to see them, obviously. They're all typically heterotrophic, not typically, they are all heterotrophic, so they have to consume other organisms in order to survive. And of course, they're all mammals, so they tend to move on their own. Now, the difference between some of the earlier animals, however, is that many of the earliest animals that we find on land were in fact insects. And insects have an exoskeleton. That is to say, they don't have traditional bones in the way we think of bones, just hardened outer tissues. And this is a great way to, 1, protect yourself, and 2, keep yourself from losing water, from dehydrating. Because once you get onto land, dehydration becomes an issue. The longer you can go without water, the more successful you're probably going to be. As I said, reptiles and amphibians, they don't have the same type of bone structure as insects, obviously. They have what's called an endoskeleton, a skeleton inside the body. So unlike insects, which had been around on land for a long, long time before this, these newcomers to the land surface took the skeletal system and reversed the idea. They put the skeleton inside the body and the soft tissues on the outside of the body. And we'll see how that became an issue for dehydration, especially with the amphibians, in a minute. So amphibians and reptiles are both ectotherms as well. Don't confuse ectotherms and exoskeleton and endoskeleton. Those aren't the same things. Ectotherms, the opposite is endotherms. Ectotherms means outside heat, meaning that they depend upon external sources of heat to help keep their body temperature up. And if any of you have actually ever had an amphibian or a reptile for a pet, you know this means two things. One, you have to have a heat source in the container with them, or else they run the risk of dying from lack of heat. They will not heat themselves up like you and I do based upon the food we eat. They do not maintain a constant temperature. So because they don't have a constant temperature, if you put an amphibian or a reptile in a cold environment, their body temperature will drop. But then again, if you leave them in a warm environment, their body temperature will go up. Whereas things like us, humans, mammals of any type, we are endotherms. So our body temperature, it does fluctuate on a daily basis. It does actually go down a little bit typically when you sleep, but it really doesn't fluctuate all that much as long as you have a regular source of food. With reptiles and amphibians, it also depends upon a source of heat. But the trade-off for this process of being ectothermic is one massive advantage that amphibians and reptiles can hold over mammals. Amphibians and reptiles, because they depend on external sources of heat to heat up their body, they have a slower metabolism. They break down food much slower. They process the food much slower. Thus, they can go longer without food, weeks in some cases. So it's not hard to find a large snake like a python or something that can go with 1 or 2 meals every month. Most of us humans can't go 1 or 2 meals within a single week and hope to be very active. So reptiles have this great ability where they can go for long periods of time without food, but the trade-off is you tend to want to stay in places that are going to keep you warm. Thus, you don't find too many amphibians and reptiles in very cold environments, unless they're really large. So you have to stay warm, but then again, you don't have to be eating every single day like a mammal would. All right. Amphibians themselves, again, we're going to focus just on amphibians now, so we're not talking reptiles, just amphibians. Amphibians themselves include the groups of frogs, toads, salamanders, and newts. They tend to always live near water, and there's always weird exceptions to this. You can occasionally find cases of amphibians living in deserts, but it's not very common. They tend to live near water because their skin is best described as thin and slimy. It dries out pretty fast, and it must be kept constantly moist because they can die of dehydration because it's so thin. And any of you guys who have dissected frogs before know that it's not too hard to cut through the skin of a frog. It's relatively thin. They'll often lay their eggs near or in a water source, and they'll spend at least part of their life, or in some cases all their life, in the water at some level. Maybe they start off in the water, then move to land. Maybe they start in the land and then move to water. Some will actually go from water to land to water in their entire lifespan. So in the classic case of frogs, they start off as tadpoles and then eventually grow the legs, lose the tail, and move to a more land-based environment. But they still spend a lot of time near water because that's where they have to lay their eggs to reproduce. That's what these pictures are here. The reproduction method for amphibians, it tends to be sexual. Their eggs lack what we call the classic white shell look of what you would consider a typical egg to be. Usually when I say egg, people think of chicken eggs that you find in the store. So these eggs don't have a shell. And if you think about it, they don't really need a shell. The eggs are placed directly in water, so the eggs don't run the risk of dehydration. And if they're not directly in water, they're usually hanging very, very close to water in some cases. So dehydration is not usually an issue. And if you actually cover all these individual little eggs here, these are all individual little eggs, with a shell, that's a lot more energy expenditure for the parents. So you can actually get more eggs without producing the shell. And of course, if you think of a classic egg shell, you have to sometimes disguise it so it doesn't stand out to predators. So we're used to seeing classic chicken eggs that are white, and that would obviously stand out to predators. Many birds will use a shell that is camouflaged, but again, that's another type of energy expenditure that amphibians don't have to compensate for because they'll hide it in water, usually it's murky water where it's not easily seen, or they're put nearby a water source so that the offspring can just drop into the water if they're hanging above the water, but they won't dress up the eggs in any type of shell because the dehydration is not an issue. So here's two pictures, one of frog eggs and then one of salamander eggs. And you can see that if I did not actually clarify which one was which, you would have no clue which one were the frog eggs and which one were the salamander eggs. They're coated in this jelly-like substance that's meant to keep them attached to a certain location and just meant to be kind of a stabilizing thing. But the eggs themselves are fairly unprotected from massive changes in temperature. The amphibians leave the water to compensate for changes in temperature because water takes a lot of heat or a lot of cold to change temperature too much. Now, moving on to reptiles. Reptiles, you can see, have a much different type of body plan than amphibians. Their bodies are evolved basically for water conservation. They typically have thick scales around their body, and the scales provide not only physical protection in some cases, like with the crocodile here or the turtle here, but they prevent water loss. And where they don't have scales particularly, they do have a pretty fair thick coat of skin, like in the smooth part here on the head and legs, upper legs there of the giant tortoise. So they have very much minimized the dehydration issue that can plague amphibians, and as a result you can find reptiles where you don't typically find amphibians. So where you might not find so many amphibians in the desert, you will find many reptiles, because keep in mind, both cases of amphibians and reptiles are ectothermic. They want to stay warm, but in the desert, water becomes an issue, a source of water, that is to say. So dehydration becomes a more critical problem. Reptiles, because of their thicker skin, have a better chance of surviving in deserts than amphibians do. But then again, if you reverse this, you can obviously find a lot of amphibians in, say, a tropical rainforest. It's hot there too, but there's a lot more moisture in the air. So reptiles have stopped water loss, but they can still absorb heat from the outside as well. And this depends upon their body size as well. But in large part, because you've prevented dehydration, this means your surface area of your body can be bigger. So as a result, we tend to see reptiles that are much, much bigger than the largest amphibians we find that are still alive today. So it's not hard to find reptiles today that easily are at the same level as most mammals, or even larger in some cases, like these two guys. There are, of course, small reptiles, but it is very hard to find any amphibian that's larger than, say, 100 pounds. It's almost impossible nowadays. The largest one, I want to say, maxes out at about somewhere between 75 to 100 pounds, and it's one of the large amphibians of Japan. So because you're not worrying about dehydration, your body size could suddenly be much bigger. Thus, you get this one group of reptiles that becomes really, really massive and have really strong skeletons, the dinosaurs. They didn't really have to worry about water loss so much as long as they had a drinking supply. They're not going to lose water through their skin, and they're very well protected. Overall, though, the reptiles tend to be better able to survive farther away than water sources than most amphibians. And the easiest trick to identifying whether you're looking at a reptile or an amphibian is look for scales and claws. Because if it has scales and claws, it's a reptile. If there's no scales, no claws, and the skin looks kind of, for lack of a better word, slimy, that's an amphibian. So there's very easy way of telling the difference between the two, even if you're just kind of looking at it. It's usually, another key thing is lack of teeth, lack of true teeth. Reptiles have true teeth, whereas amphibians typically don't have true teeth. So reptiles have many behaviors that are evolved to help maintain their body heat. Typically, if you've ever had a reptile for a pet, you know that they like to sunbathe. Again, you have to have a source of heat in the container with them, or else they won't be able to maintain their body temperature. Oftentimes in winter areas, they will go dormant. They will drop their metabolism very, very, very low and not be anywhere near as active as they will be in the hotter seasons. Or the other alternative is to live someplace where it's always hot, like the tropics or the deserts, where you don't have to worry about a cold season. There's just the wet and the dry season. Keep in mind, you're not going to find many amphibians or reptiles living at the top of high mountains or in extreme cold climates like the Arctic, the Antarctic, or the tundra, because again, they can't conserve their body heat the way mammals can, the way birds can. But you can find them in places far away from water. In some, if you're talking only about reptiles, that is. Amphibians, you're pretty much limited to the tropics. Reptile reproduction. Now, reptiles are one of the first one of the first groups to come up with the evolutionary adaptation of a true amniotic egg. This is an egg that has an outside coating, and because it has an outside coating, it requires more energy expenditure from the mother. Thus, you don't get quite as many eggs as you do with amphibians. You saw with those pictures of the frogs and the salamanders, there was a couple hundred eggs in there easily. Usually, you only see a couple hundred eggs with something larger in terms of reptiles like turtles or perhaps maybe even dinosaurs. The shell themselves are sometimes not what we consider to be classic shells, in that they tend to be, for a better description, leathery. You can see in this picture here, it looks like there's actually a dent in the shell, and it looks like this little guy kind of just tore through the shell. He didn't crack the shell. This is meant to, 1, protect the young, and 2, to prevent dehydration. Many reptiles will bury their eggs as well, so the egg is also meant to prevent the embryo from being crushed from the weight of the ground or the dirt on top of the egg. So they will tear, but they won't crack like typical bird shell eggs. Most reptiles tend to have very little in the way of parental care other than finding a safe spot to lay the eggs and then burying the eggs nice and neat, and occasionally they'll guard the area for a little while. The exceptions to this rule are twofold. 1, we know that female crocodiles will guard their young very, very, very viciously. They will guard the territory where their eggs are, and those are one of the rare exceptions where you see reptilian parental care. Another possible exception, because of their large size, again, the dinosaurs. We don't know how much parental care they had one way or another. We suspect quite a bit because it would take a while for their young to become independent. So usually the more time it takes for the young to grow to independence, the more parental care is required. But most reptiles lay 4 or more eggs at a time, but to get to the hundreds, you have to go back to amphibians, typically. Now, in comparison of their movements, amphibians, if you actually study how they move, they don't quite have the strength and the bone structure to lift their full body off the ground. And it comes from the fact that their bones are kind of put here at the sides. And so their limbs don't have the strength or the structure where other creatures would have the bones more directly underneath. So the limbs are described as being at the side of the amphibians, thus these guys tend to drag their stomach when they walk or jump. Same thing as frog, they kind of let their stomach hit the ground a little bit. But with reptiles, the legs are much more directly oriented below the body in terms of the skeletal system, so that they can in fact lift themselves fully off the ground. Makes them a lot faster on land, but keep in mind, amphibians have to spend at least part of their time, part of their lifespan in the water. So having them on the sides of your body is a bit more advantageous when you're in the water. Being on land, remember, requires a lot more than being in the water in terms of energy. And so heart sizes tend to differ between the two groups. If you're going to spend most of your time on land, you need to have a very efficient heart to bring more oxygen in your blood to the rest of your body. So if you look at a typical fish heart, it's only what we call a 2-chamber heart, and I will show you this on the next slide. Amphibians all have what we call a 3-chamber heart, which is a bit more efficient than a fish heart, and most reptiles also have a 3-chamber heart. But when you're a large reptile, like a crocodile, you have to be even more efficient because you're carrying a lot of weight. Then you require a 4-chambered heart, and that's what crocodiles have. We suspect some dinosaurs had a 4-chambered heart. We know birds have a very efficient 4-chambered heart, and so do mammals. So I'm going to show you a picture of how these heart chambers look in comparison to each other on the next slide. So here we see a fish circulatory system. The capillaries here would be in the lungs, or the, not the lungs, fish, gills circulation, right there, Mr.Y. So the blood gets full of oxygen, gets transported throughout the body takes away the oxygen, and the blood gets pumped back. This is our heart here. You have 1 chamber, you have 2 chambers, pumps it to the gills, and then pumped again. It's a single loop, 2-chambered heart system. Very simple, very basic, and for a fish, that's really all you need because you're not supporting your full weight underwater. The water is carrying you through your buoyancy. For reptiles and amphibians and most reptiles, you have what you call a 3-chamber system, and you'll notice that what this 3-chamber system allows you to do is, 1, you have 2 loops now instead of 1 loop, and you're isolating the oxygen-rich blood a bit. So This would be capillaries in either the gills or the lungs, depending on what your stage of your life you are if you're an amphibian, coming from your lungs, for instance, or gills to the heart. It gets fed through one chamber, then a second chamber, then pumped to the rest of the body, loses the oxygen, comes back, really is deoxygenated now, and then pumped back to the gills/lungs. Bit more efficient. It keeps the system much more in tune with making sure the oxygen supply reaches throughout the body. And again, because you're dealing with the full weight of gravity, you need to have a more efficient heart system than you had with the fish. So this is a 1, 2, 3 chambered heart. Then over here, birds and mammals, and again, large reptiles like crocodiles and possibly dinosaurs as well, have 4-chambered hearts. And you'll see here with a 4-chambered heart, you're clearly keeping the oxygenated blood, the blood in red, away from the deoxygenated blood, the blood in blue. So again, you have the oxygen-rich blood coming from the lungs through 1 chamber, then 2 chambers, then being pumped to the body, losing the oxygen, the deoxygenated blood being pumped back through 1 chamber, 2 chambers, and then pumped back through the gills. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4 chambers. Much more efficient system, especially if you're a large creature who spends your entire life on land. And again, birds, mammals, large reptiles all have this system. Amphibians and most reptiles, smaller reptiles especially, will have a 3-chambered heart, and fish, again, because they're not supporting their full body weight, and they don't need to be able to support their full body weight, they'll just have a simple 2-chambered system. All right, so reptiles are some of the first original large land carnivores. There's other carnivores before reptiles. Like I said, insects were around, but there wasn't any truly large carnivores. The majority of reptiles are carnivorous, I should say it that way. Only reptiles, like I said, have claws in comparison between reptiles and amphibians. Some turtles and a few lizards are the only examples I can find of reptiles who are herbivores or at least omnivores. But by and large, typically reptiles tend to be carnivores. And of course, the largest reptiles, the dinosaurs, are often presenting classic carnivores, but you can still find a few examples of herbivores or at least omnivores. So reptiles tend to be the first where we see what we would define as true teeth. You can see the classic sharp teeth here, this guy here. Some reptilian herbivores, like turtles, may not have teeth at all. They may have more of a beak system, kind of like some birds, or they may have teeth that are just slightly flatter. So it just depends on what their diet is. But most reptiles are going to have the sharp little pointy teeth. You can almost count on that as a constant. Reptilian carnivores can't shear their food, however. That is to say, they can't chew your food. They don't really have the teeth to do the chewing process like mammals do. We'll talk about that later on when we get to mammals. So instead of trying to chew the food, which they can't do, because again, there's no teeth here that look like they're for chewing, they will try and shear their food into smaller pieces, or they'll try and swallow it whole. So if you know anything about crocodiles, one of their behaviors is this little process called a death roll. And part of the reason is to disorient their prey, but the other part is to try and actually tear hunks of flesh away from the prey that are easily for them to fit down their mouth, their esophagus. And again, reptiles will often kind of undulate their head up and down in a way to try and swallow their food whole and rip it into smaller pieces if they can. Some reptiles, like snakes for instance, have the ability to dislocate their jaw and basically make their jaw muscles fit around objects that are larger than their head. Thus, you can see an X-ray like this, which is in fact a true X-ray. The story of this goes that this was a corn snake that a veterinarian found, it was taken to a veterinarian. It was found in an old chicken coop. And so if you think about it, this makes sense. The snake had gone through a place that smelled like chickens, there was no chickens around, and saw 2 large white, kind of round-shaped objects. What did the snake think? It thought they were eggs, so it swallowed 2 light bulbs. So the veterinarian did emergency surgery and actually removed the light bulbs, and the snake survived, and they released it. Keep in mind, because you have many cases of carnivorous and predatory reptiles. This is one of the first examples you see of venom and toxin use. Now, amphibians will sometimes use toxin as a defensive mechanism. I'm thinking of like the poison arrow frogs in South America, but it's usually a defensive system. It's never used in an offensive way. So reptiles are the first to actually take chemical warfare and weaponize it. And if you actually study the way fangs work in poisonous snakes like vipers, they work essentially like a modern day hypodermic needle, where there's a pit just behind the eye, and when the reptile bites down, it'll actually inject the fluid from that pit down through there, and it runs along a groove in the teeth, and then it drips out the teeth. The snake can in fact die if it does get some of the poison into its own bloodstream, so these things will actually fold in when the snake closes its mouth. And while some reptiles don't have particularly any poisons that they produce, things like the Komodo dragon here are notorious for being able to create bites that infect very easily. That is to say, what they will do is they will find a prey and they'll just bite it and they'll let it go. They won't bother to try and struggle with the prey. They'll let the infection kill the prey eventually, and they have such a good sense of smell, they can find the prey later when it's dead. And one of the more interesting things about snake behavior is that snakes in general, if they are poisonous, tend to be pretty passive. Because if you're a poisonous snake, you really only have to bite your prey once and then let it go and die. You can find it later when it's dead. Whereas the non-poisonous snakes, those tend to be really aggressive in some cases when they're hunting. They have to be able to wrestle their opponent. Things like the python, the boa constrictors, they will strangle their prey to death. Whereas the poisonous snakes, they know they just have to bite, release, and let the prey go off and die, and they can find the prey later. There are exceptions to this case. Things like the king cobra is one of those snakes that is both highly venomous and highly aggressive. It won't run away from larger creatures. It will actually stand its ground, and that's one of those rare cases of a reptile that's both poisonous and aggressive. Most of the time, poisonous creatures tend to be fairly shy, because they know they don't have to out-wrestle or outmatch physically the prey that they're going after. So that's the wrap-up for amphibians and reptiles, guys. Make sure if you have questions you ask me during class, and I'll see you in the next PowerPoint.